So that's as good a segue as any into the West. I have a feeling I know who your number one pick is. But before you get into your number one pick, I'd like for you to maybe just give us a high level thought on the West this year. Any interesting trends or personnel issues, like you mentioned with the wide receiver situation in the East? Does it carry over to the West? Are there defensive concerns, coaching concerns in the West? Let me know what you think.
Yeah, well, everything we discussed really is at play, I think, in the SEC West as well. The receiver thing, I think, is as true or more true in the West than it is even in the East. And then also, obviously, there's a lot of coaching questions in the SEC West. We have Ole Miss that's currently facing probation. Hugh Freeze is gone as the coach, and they've got a guy now Matt that is pretty well regarded by the fan base, but doesn't really have any experience as a head coach. And that can be a very difficult thing when you actually, you have to take over preseason and really plan, the team and organize them. That can be difficult. We have Ed Orgeron taking over at LSU. And I know my thought on Ed Orgeron. I don't think very highly of Ed Orgeron. I'm sorry. I know he's a Louisiana guy. He's what you want in terms of a motivator. That doesn't necessarily translate to being a head coach. Being a head coach is it's your ability to plan meals for student athletes and ensure you have an academic plan to keep them eligible and ensure they have a proper weight plan. When is practice time going to be organized? Which graduate assistant's going to practice, game planning for which opponent in which days in the month of April? That's what a head coach succeeds at. And that's why Saban is so good. That's why Meyer is so good, because they're incredibly detail oriented when it comes to what their staff's doing in every moment of the day. It's why they're a CEO. And I think you can be successful to a certain degree as a great motivator. And I think Ed Orgeron is a great motivator. But I just don't have a lot of faith that he's going to be able to do this in the offseason. It's a broken record. We said it a lot last year. But I like him way better as an interim coach when you step into an existing situation that's already been structured than I do as a coordinator or, even especially a head coach where now you have to really plan things at a high level. I just don't think it's his strength, and I fear that's going to pan out. So that's my step back coaching discussion.
So, and that's funny because we were talking about this the other day. I think it was Bleacher Report did an article, kind of a big expose on the whole timeline of Ed Orgeron leading up to LSU making the decision for him to get that job. And I saw a lot of people tweeting it and talking about this article like, hey man, this is our coach, this is awesome, look at all the things he said, these quotes in this article. And my takeaway from it was, if I'm an LSU fan and I read this article, I'm kind of scared because it really sort of reinforced the things that you and I said when we did our review of Orgeron as a head coach in the offseason, where we didn't have a lot of confidence in some of these CEO type things that you talk about. And I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like that whole article with his own quotes sort of supported that.
Yeah, I agree. And the nature of the articles, he talked about how, how he got the job, how he was convinced, he always knew he was going to get it until the moment that they lost to Florida. And then he didn't think he was going to get it. And then he realized he was going to get it. And he went back and forth. And I was kind of honestly almost disturbed by the lack of, insight or introspection, that he was so emotional with this in the first place. And then when he got the job, he apparently contacted Lane Kiffin, who called the AD. I'm sure Kiffin called the AD and told him, oh yeah, I'll be, unless I get a head coaching job, I'll be the coordinator. And Orgeron was sold on the fact that was going to happen, and apparently a little surprised or blindsided. And he mentioned, well, I guess Alabama didn't want him to go here and yada, yada. But again, it was, it was a little naive to not realize Lane Kiffin was going to play you, because that's what Lane Kiffin does. If you've ever looked at his Twitter, he is a master of troll. And my takeaway from all of it, with him getting excited over certain things, being excited about his team. I think it was a week or two ago he canceled practice, took his team bowling. I've also read some other articles. Right when he was at Ole Miss, he was very skeptical or paranoid, frankly, of the media. He was extremely aggressive. He made the entire everyone on the field had to sprint from drill to drill. I don't mean the players, the graduate assistants, the coaches did, the coordinators did, and he had a 55-year-old coach with ice bags on his after practice every day, because you had a 55-year-old coach trying to sprint from drill to drill. And that was at Orgeron, and he was hard as heck, and his players hated him at Ole Miss. Now I think he feels like he has to swing the other way. He has to be super positive and super energetic. And I think it certainly makes for a better image. I think it makes for a better coach, because guys want to play for someone that's that energetic and happy. But I think you also lose something when you aren't as harsh with the players. And again, unbridled optimism can be really good when your team's good and you get on a roll. But when things start going poorly, that can go south, and you can be really, frankly, things like Lane Kiffin not coming to LSU, you can really blind yourself to a lot of deficiencies you have. And yeah, I mean, it just really drove home to me that I don't know that Ed Orgeron has the personality you want for a head coach.
And last thing I'll say about this, because this isn't a coaching discussion, this is more about the SEC West in general. But two things: one, we love Ed Orgeron, both of us. We've been pretty high on him most of his career. We just don't necessarily love him as a head coach. One of the things that scares me, you sort of touched on, and I don't know if you were trying to touch on it, but one of the things that scared me was the fact that Ed Orgeron felt like, and it looks like it was true, that whether or not he got that job was contingent upon winning a handful of games at the end of the year. And I feel like that's what got them into the mess they got into with keeping and extending Les Miles into last year. Was he won that game at the end of the year, and everybody got full of excitement. A head coach decision at that level should not hinge on one game here or there. It should be a lot more complex and involved than not just a overall win-loss record, but specific games here and there at the end of the season. What do you think about that before we get into ranking the West?
Well, I agree with that as well. I mean, LSU fired a coach last year because one team failed to snap the ball within a second, and then they almost didn't kept a coach after he failed to score within a time frame. And we talked about that a lot. That my issues with Les Miles weren't that necessarily that he failed to score right there in that Auburn game, because it was quite close. My issue with Les Miles is that he had horrible clock management to get to that point. One, and two, they failed to score for the entire rest of that ball game. And sort of similarly with Ed Orgeron, whether or not he wins a ball game with players that he didn't recruit, where he's trying to really push for it, maybe and they did make some bad clock management decisions, but as a head coach, that's kind of a minor part of his job, frankly. Like we said, organizing recruiting and practice, and basically the functioning of your team at a high level, and how well trained they are and how well coached and what kind of scheme they run. That's where the head coach comes into play. And they're, kind of focusing on, in the micro on specific things that happen, rather than, in my opinion, focusing on the way that the program developed as a whole. And that's dangerous. And I guess one last thing I will say with Orgeron that was really weird to me was he talked about how he got told by Oliva that he was their guy, and he was always worried that they were going to give the job to Herman, but he talked to Oliva, and they hadn't offered it to Herman. He was the first one they were offered, and I'm the only coach that they offered. I was their guy, and they knew I wanted to be their guy, and that's great, but I mean, I don't know if he's either really trying to spin that, or if he doesn't realize the way coaching searches work. You don't offer anyone
I hope.
until they've already said yes. I mean, you go through back channels, because you're offering somebody $8 million a year, what have you. You go to them and say, "Hey, how much will it take for you to come here?" Their agent talks to your people. You set a dollar amount, and you don't offer the job until you can put a contract in front of them and say, "Here is the $8.2 million contract you said that you would have to come here." sign on the dotted line, and then they sign. So I don't know. That whole thing is just absolutely bizarre to me. And maybe the talent level in that state will keep things going for a while. But if I were an LSU fan, I would be very concerned about the future.
And now that LSU fans have tuned out for the rest of the season because we pissed them all off, let's get into ranking the West. And for me, I'm going to do my rankings first because you did yours first in the East, and I don't want people to think that I just copy off of you and that I have my own thoughts about it. So I'm going to go first. SEC West for me, and I'm going to go faster than you because you've got more analysis. I've got Alabama and Auburn 1 and 2. I think Alabama wins the West this year if I'm picking a winner, because I do think Auburn will have a significant jump in quality of quarterback. And as much as I said in our East talk that I don't want to talk just about teams based on how easy their record is going to be, how easy it is going to be to get to a good record. I do think Auburn's going to have a good record at the end of the year. I think their schedule is a little more favorable for them to work in a new quarterback this season. But defensively, I think Alabama, people don't understand still 10 years into this thing that Alabama just reloads on defense, and they released their depth chart today, and I was looking at it and I was like, this is just crazy. Like this level of talent being able to reload this easily is just not fair. After that, I'm gonna go surprise pick, I guess, maybe not a surprise. I'm gonna go Texas A&M. I think you and I both have some questions for them again at quarterback, but I think someone's going to find a way to maybe keep his job by finally putting forth an offense that doesn't 100% rely on a quarterback making the most ridiculous, crazy throws you've ever seen 10, 15 times a game. After that, I'm going LSU. They lost a ton of people, and you're going to get into personnel losses, I'm sure. But they and Tennessee are the two teams in the SEC this year that lost not just a lot of bodies, but a lot of really critical bodies that contributed to their seasons the last couple of years. I think Tennessee's probably a little worse off in that regard, but LSU's pretty bad too. And we still haven't seen an offense for them. I think Etling's coming back, and nobody's real excited about that. Gonna go Mississippi State after that. People are higher on Fitzgerald than I am, but I think as a team, as a unit, they're going to find some wins this year that maybe they didn't in the past. And they have shown when they need to put up some points, especially late in the season last year, they were able to do that to kind of cover for what has been historically not the best defense in the world, at least recently. And then I've got Arkansas after that. Still got a good quarterback, but what are they going to do on defense? I don't know that we know. And then rounding out the bottom, I've got Ole Miss. I think they've got too much turmoil in that program right now to do anything significant. The one big one that I might be the most off on, I think, is probably Arkansas. They're a team that I could see. They're kind of an enigma to me. I think they could be either really bad or pretty damn good this year. But that's the one that I'm kind of on the fence about. So that's my West. We'll revisit it at the end, but now I'd love for you to get into your West and tell me all the ways that I'm wrong.
Well, at the top, it shouldn't surprise you that my first pick is Alabama. I don't really know what else to say with it other than at this point, with whatever 7, 8 recruiting classes in a row ranked number one, the talent level they have is just absolutely absurd. And I was looking at the S&P rankings earlier today. I realized, for one thing, by the way, apparently my West ranking is going to match S&P's ranking exactly, with two teams that are ranked 23rd and 24th in the S&P flipped. And Alabama in that is 7-point favorite over number 2 Florida State. And then there's 7 points between Florida State and number 13 Washington. So actually, I guess 8 points, which puts that closer to Yeah, I don't know. 15 Florida. It just the gap between them and anyone is, the difference between like the number 2 team and the number 15 team in the country, statistically, recruiting, etc., is the same as the gap and between Alabama and anybody else. And it at some level the lack of returning production will impact them. I'm curious about their pass rush and how effective they'll be, but we talked about this again with Missouri and Florida and all. The biggest thing that really makes defenses work, frankly, is talent. If you recruit a ton of talent, you're going to be really good defensively. Offensively, there's a lot more things that go into it. I think just because it's so built on flow. But Alabama returns most of their pieces offensively, so I just can't see them being bad. The next best team for me, I'm with you. I think it's Auburn. I think Auburn has a shot to be a very good team this year. It's really funny to me that we posted a thing with quarterbacks, and I'm already being taking a lot of heat for saying Stidham is not a dual threat quarterback. Somehow, me saying that Stidham is not quite as accurate as I think, as you noted in a comment, Stidham is not as accurate as Sean White, who was the fourth most accurate quarterback in college football last year, was a massive blow to Stidham. And likewise,
That
yeah,
was y'all. Sorry to cut you off, but y'all, we love getting comments because usually there's some pretty healthy debate in our comment section, and people love to tell us how wrong we are, and we love that because that's we want to make this channel really engaging for everybody. But when of all the things that Husky said last week that would piss off Auburn fans, the one safe thing I thought that he said was that he's not as fast as Nick Marshall. But apparently, to one of our new favorite commenters, that was just the most absurd thing that anybody has ever said. Apparently, he's built like Tim Tebow and will run a damn near close 40 time at the combine as Nick Marshall. So it's funny what people pick up on that gets people riled up and what people let go that you'd think would. But that one that you said that you dared to say that Jarrett Stidham is not as fast as Nick Marshall, I thought that was hilarious that you took flack for
yeah.
that.
Well, I said he had a 4.840, which I think people, I don't know, maybe people do think that's slow. For comparison's sake, Gerard Evans was the number one dual threat junior college quarterback the year that Stidham came out of high school, and Gerard Evans ran a 4.8 flat 40 in the combine and was just drafted. He also ran the zone read at Virginia Tech. A 4.840 is not actually slow for a quarterback. That is definitely a dual threat speed. For anything below 4.8, if you're in like the 4.6 range, which everybody likes to claim their quarterback runs at 4.5 or 4.6, you're a receiver speed wise, and Stedham's just not quite that fast. It really wasn't meant to be a huge insult. But anyway,
Yeah, one more thing before you get on to the next thing that you're going to say. Everybody there's a lot of people that played high school sports and at some point in their life got hand timed or played football with a bunch of guys that got hand timed. And so they think they know how fast a 4.540 or a 4.640 is. And when they say, oh yeah, I ran a 4.540 in high school. No, you didn't. Almost everyone I know who thinks that is completely wrong. You don't realize how fast a 4.540 is until you stand next to one, and most people haven't. So to say like, oh, that guy, I mean, you'd be surprised how many, like you said, how fast, 4.6, that's wide receiver speed. How many running backs in the NFL are running 4.5, 4.6 kind of speed, and they're at the peak of their game.
Yeah, it is what it is. But no, I mean, I think Stidham is actually quite a good quarterback in a conference that doesn't necessarily have a ton of great quarterbacks. So, yeah, I mean, I do think I do think he's good. I think they will be a good team. They return a lot of key pieces in their line, returning. I'm not sure how great the offensive line will be because it was at times very good last year, but I still think it's going to be pretty darn solid. They still have, you get all your tailbacks back. You have a lot more depth at quarterback, if nothing else. You return most of your receivers, so I can't really see the offense taking any sort of substantial step back next season for Auburn. And so I have to think they're pretty good. Now defensively, I don't think they're going to be quite as good. At times defensively they were very good last year. To me, it's not so much about the numbers that they lost as it is who they lost. I mean, they had some pretty good players, and guys like Carl Lawson and Montravius Adams just don't grow on trees, and I don't think their production can be really replaced with the rest of the guys. And a lot like Alabama a few years ago, they also had a ton of depth because they had all those players, and I just don't think it's going to be quite the same. But they're still, I think, again, recruiting is the most important thing. Talent's the most important thing. And Auburn, maybe outside of LSU, is the most talented team in this conference. And defensively, they've been building up talent. And, Dontavius Russell and Marlon Davidson are darn good defensive linemen. I think Trey Williams has a chance to be really good. I'm not as high sometimes on guys like Deshaun Davis as some people are. But, in the secondary that I think I said a lot last year was overrated. I only said that last year because I guess maybe it's like Stidham's speed. Some people started getting in their heads. I think that it was the best secondary in the conference. I thought that was unreasonable, but they were still a very good secondary. And so I think they're a complete team now. I don't think they have the quality at receiver, frankly, to be a really high level team. It's hard to be explosive without one or two, number one receivers. And they've got some guys like Craig Myers or Slayton that may come on to some degree, but I just don't know that they're there yet. And if they are there yet, I don't know if they're there quite at the talent level some other teams are. So that's why I have Auburn, number two. And again, it's unfortunate. I think Auburn would be number one in the East, I should say. I think they're the second best team in the conference. They're just unfortunately have to be in the same conference as Alabama.
Yeah, I think the wide receiver point is a good one. And right now where Auburn fans are is where a lot of people have been in the past when they look at a particular unit that's not particularly talented on paper, or at least doesn't have the stats to show for it, and they'll do this thing, and it's kind of a double-edged sword where they mentally place someone maybe based on star ranking or what they saw at A-Day or what they have heard about in practice, and they mentally place them up in a top tier of SEC wide receivers because they're like, oh, well, this guy, I'm hearing all these things about this guy, so he's a given is pretty good. And then this other guy was decent last year, and he's going to be better. But what you don't realize is when you're having to place true freshmen in that 1A slot or a JUCO transfer or somebody like that, a lot of times when you're comparing that to a deeper unit, they have those same guys. They're just second or third down the line at a particular position. Namely, I'm thinking about like a guy like Jerry Jeudy at Alabama, who's not even going to crack the official starting lineup in the depth chart, and he's a phenomenal talent, and he'd start at most places in the country. So you got that at a lot of places. So when you're having to play these really, really new guys, sometimes it says something about what you lack and not necessarily about what you have.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess if Auburn fans, apparently I riled them up with the Stidham thing without meaning to, just because I was saying there, I felt like there was a misconception there. But if you don't really buy me on receivers, I guess to sort of explain it, I think Cornelius at Arkansas has a pretty good shot at being better than what Auburn has. Any of receivers Auburn has. I think Chark at LSU was probably better than any of the receivers. Brown at Ole Miss, or actually a number of guys at Ole Miss, Texas A&M's Kirk, and then Alabama probably has 5 or 6 guys that are better than anyone Auburn's going to be able to put out on the field. So I don't think Auburn's unit is, terrible, and I want anybody to take that impression out of it, but they don't have the receiver talent that most of the other teams have, and they don't have what I see as a true number one guy, at least not a proven one yet.
And that's the thing. Proven is key, because we may turn out to be completely wrong in this. But if you look at the odds based on what we've seen over the last decades of football, the odds are they're not going to field a top unit in college football. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a guy that's really good, but just hasn't had the chance to prove himself yet, and will emerge throughout the season as being a top player. But again, you want to have two, three, four of those guys if you're going to make a title run. So again, you and I could both be wrong on this, and it could prove out that they have the best unit in the league, but it will have to be based on things that we don't know yet about this Auburn unit.
Agreed. And, I think this bears mentioning because it's going to come up a bunch now. I'm going to start moving a lot faster. The receivers often end up causing a lot of blame for quarterbacks. I think last year Auburn's receiving core was fairly poor to borderline quite poor, frankly. And at times when they played better teams, the quarterbacks took a lot of heat for their inability to generate anything in the passing game. Well, it's hard to throw to receivers that aren't open. And, I think sometimes receivers are a cog that is just as important as any other cog on the offense, and they get overlooked. But to segue a little bit, if you have receiver, that's true if you have somebody like Stidham or Sean White that can throw the ball pretty well, but all the receivers in the world don't really do you any good if you can't complete a forward pass. And that's kind of the issue with my number 3 team in the West and LSU. uh, Now, LSU's number 3, frankly, almost by default. They have a ton of talent defensively, like they do every year. They lose a ton of guys. Only maybe bring back, depending on how you want to count it, 4 returning starters. But one, their recruiting hasn't been quite so dominant that I can necessarily assume they're all going to turn around and start. 2, we've already discussed the issue that neither one of us have a ton of confidence in on Orgeron. And let me note that actually goes a long way in this discussion. And 3, I don't really know where the production is going to come from offensively. I think Geis is a very good tailback. I think he's one of the better backs in the SEC. I still think Fournette was the better back. Geis came in last year. We talked about this quite a bit, that there was this weird deal where we had 5 or 6 SEC teams that were among the worst we've seen in a long time in run defense. I'm going to call you out here, Mississippi State and Arkansas and Missouri and Ole Miss. And when teams, particularly 2 teams, Auburn and LSU, played those teams in a bunch, everybody kind of freaked out about their rushing offense. And that for LSU was a period where, Fournette was healthy for the Ole Miss game rather, and ran all over them. And then in several of the other games, though, he was injured and Geis was the guy. Well, the problem was everybody got this impression that Geis was an incredible ball carrier because of all his averages, but he only started a handful of the games. And in those games where he did start, it was kind of skewed by the fact that he was playing lesser competition. So when that happens, people get I guess it's just sort of a weird perception of what a player is and, what he's capable of. And I do think he's a very good running back. Don't get me wrong, but, his 100-plus yard games, they came against Jacksonville State, Missouri, Southern Miss, who, by the way, was terrible last year, Arkansas, Texas A&M, and Louisville in the final. And when you want to look at games, when he played Wisconsin, he had 1.5 yards per carry. Mississippi State, 3.8 yards per carry. When he played Ole Miss, he had 3.5 yards per carry. Alabama, 4 yards per carry. Florida, 4.3 yards per carry. Even the Louisville game, he only had 5.3 yards per carry. So his yards per carry average was inflated by the fact that he had, against Southern Miss, for example, over 10 yards a carry. Against Missouri, 9.6 yards per carry. Arkansas, 12 yards per carry. He really feasted off the terrible teams in the middle while Fournette was injured, and he was getting 15 to 20 touches, where at the very least they were trying to pitch count Fournette. So all that said, the next problem, as I said, to me, this is the running theme in the SEC this year. There's a lack of proven receiver production. And I know LSU was not necessarily a great receiving team last year, and I say that, very lightly, frankly. But of their 5 top pass catchers, only 1 returns. In fact, I'm going to take that back. Actually, the 6 top pass catchers. Malachi Dupree was 1. He's gone. DJ Chark was 2. He is back. Trevin Durrell was 3. He's gone. Deshaun Smith was 4. He's gone. Colin Jeter was 5. He's gone. Leonard Fournette was 6. He's gone. And then after that, you've got Geis, the backup tight end, and Anderson. Basically, of anyone on the team that had more than 10 catches, the only guy back is DJ Chark. And I think Chark is a very good receiver, but I think people underestimate, as has happened a few times in LSU's recent memory, that they had some pretty darn good receivers in Dupree and Doral. And I don't know that it's Landry Jones and Odell Beckham Jr., but um, those were darn good receivers in my view. I thought they played at a very high level, and they just didn't get a lot of opportunities. But I certainly can't see them being better for losing those two players.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important. There's two things that are really important there. One is the obvious that they're losing all this production, and two is the obvious that, or not so obvious, that they're losing all this production that wasn't able to produce last year. And it goes back to what you've said a long time, a number of times, in that when you have to replace a guy like due to injury or whatever, you're having to fill with basically a guy who's not a starter for a reason, and it makes you weak all across the board. And especially we see this with wide receiver and DB situations when somebody has to get replaced, you really feel it. So now we're replacing all these guys in a unit. I'm high on Chark too, but like you said, you had really top potential from if they went to another school, potential top first round talent in two of the wide receivers they lost last year. That's going to be a lot to replace.
Yeah, and I think you made it. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. In that, at DB and receiver, when you lose a guy and you replace him, people think, okay, well, I've lost the number 2 guy and moved to number 1. Well, that's actually usually not the bigger point to me. The bigger problem to me when you lose, for example, your number 1, it's you drop guy number 1 out of the lineup, and in a 3 wide set, you drop number 1 and you pick up number 4. 2 and 3 were in the lineup already, so you traded 1 for 4. LSU, with their losses, they're going, Drake Davis is maybe potential then as the starting receiver for them. He was the 6th last year. He had 1 reception for 19 yards, right? So essentially you're traded your number 1 and number 3 guy for maybe your number 4. We'll just say for the sake of argument 4. So rather than having your 1, 2, and 3 receiver from last year, you're going to have your number 2 receiver, your number 4 receiver, and your number 5 receiver. It's a pretty big drop off. And considering that they're going to have the same quarterback, which is, I think, extremely concerning because it means nobody else that they've managed to recruit is somehow any better than Edling, and that they lost, a lot of guys in the offensive line. I don't see the offense taking a step forward, and I don't see the defense being as good given the fact that they lost a lot of players. And it's really unclear at this point what's going on with Arden Key, and I don't know. I just don't see how for example, Darwin Adams less LSU defense is going to make up for an offense that's probably. There's no reason on paper for LSU's offense not to get worse. I know it wasn't great last year. I know that may be crazy for people to hear. It can always get worse. It can always get better. And I think they may get worse. So anyway, long discussion on LSU. We need to move on.
So just before we move on, to illustrate your point about replacing a DB or a wide receiver, even though you feel like you have a lot of positions, a lot of people there that can kind of cover the gap, true or false, does Alabama win the national championship last year if Eddie Jackson's healthy?
I think true. Yeah.
Because them losing him required a lot of pieces to move in that secondary, and they paid for it. Anyway, all right, go on to your number 4.
Well, and I'll take 5 seconds to say I was reading an article, a quote from a coach recently that said, in his opinion, that cost him the title game. I think it was in one of the preseason mags, but yeah, I mean, Jackson fell out of the lineup, and it's not just that Jackson was replaced by Fitzpatrick at safety. It was when Jackson goes out, Fitzpatrick moves from nickel to safety, which means that Tony Brown moves in at nickel, and Tony Brown at nickel was the thing that killed him. Not, he's the one that gave up the touchdown pass to end the game. It wasn't Fitzpatrick versus Jackson in the secondary. Anyway, next pick. All right, so we've gone through the top 3. 4th, I do have Ole Miss. Put a huge question mark for the reasons we've discussed before. We don't know how this team's going to respond to adversity, but they have recruited very well. I mean, they have multiple 4- and 5-star receivers: A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf, Van Jefferson. One of the better, again, it comes down to receivers to me this year because there are truly haves and have-nots. Ole Miss has them, and Shea Patterson, I don't think he's necessarily the all-world quarterback some people do. That's just my personal opinion. I do think he's very good though, and in a conference without a lot of receivers, he's going to have give them the ability to score points. Still don't really see them necessarily being able to run the ball just because they haven't in a long time. One of the curiosities to me is going to be if they run a very different style of offense. I'm curious how well this air raid concept they're going to institute is going to work. But the thing that really holds them back though is again, it's a lot like Tennessee last year. They were never great defensively, and when they got banged up, they were flat out bad. And they did lose a lot of players defensively, and I can't necessarily see them replacing, particularly the defensive line, which for the most part, Ole Miss last year, and they've done this the past couple of years. Their statistical profile defensively has been one of the most boomer bust in the country. And I forget the stat I looked up at some point last year, but it was like they were like ninth in the country in stuff rate and 108th in explosive plays allowed. So they either stopped you at the line of scrimmage or they gave up a touchdown because the secondary was just so poor tackling. And if that's your problem, then you're not going to get better by losing DJ Jones, Isaac Gross, and Fidel Brown. And I know they've got some other good players on the D line, but they don't have anywhere near the depth. And I think that's a really significant issue because they run with such a high tempo. You really need a lot of depth defensively because their defensive starters play a lot of snaps. And I think they run the danger this year. Maybe I don't know that they've really had this problem before, honestly. On under since they hired Freeze, where their depth is thin enough that they may wear out the defense if they're not careful. And I think they were cognizant of that last year, and there were games like the Alabama game where they intentionally slowed things down. But without Freeze there and with a new coordinator, I could see that becoming a problem where I think after the first string, if they have to rotate in backups, was it Prescott's year where Mississippi State was undefeated through like the first 8 games? There was this weird stat that when their starting D line was in, they were like a top 10 defense, and when the backups were in, they were like 60th in the country, because the drop off was just so cataclysmic. I think they have the same problem. I don't think the backup D line is anywhere near the caliber of the starters. And I think last year really proved that the back seven is not solid in tackling, and they're not physical enough. And so I just think that's going to be kind of an Achilles heel. And maybe I think again, much like recent years, the start of the season they're going to be better than the end of the season. As they get banged up and tired, and they get some injuries, it's going to be hard for them to keep momentum. Plus, the coaching change is going to take a lot of wind out of their sails. So, moving on, Texas A&M is my fifth pick. 5, 6, and 7 are all very interesting to me because they all have unique issues. Texas A&M, I just don't think they can replace. For me, it's not just Myles Garrett, but it's Myles Garrett and Deshaun Hall. Did wonders for that team defensively last year. They were crucial in every snap of basically making them a solvent defense. And without those two guys, I'm not really sold that they can hold up defensively because the rest of the defense is a little bit suspect. Armani Watts is a solid player, but I think it's telling that he's kind of seen as the go-to guy on the defense by a lot because I don't think he's really necessarily an elite player. He's just, maybe a third team all SEC kind of defender, and that's about the best they've got. And the rest of the defense, they've recruited fairly well, but there's not a lot of signs they've polished. Further, offensively, they lose both starting offensive tackles, and again, their recruiting has not been what it was the first few years under Sumlin. They return one receiver in Christian Kirk, and they don't return what was a quarterback in Trevor Knight that when he was healthy, they were good, and the moment he got banged up later in the year, that offense just imploded. And that kind of tells me that, even though Humanak did an okay job subbing him late in the season, I just don't think they're going to resemble the team that they looked like last year when they were still a run first team. Um, I don't see it. I don't see how the offense can really function at a high level, frankly. And yeah, again, just too many between Reynolds, Seals Jones, Noyle, to Boyo. That was 4 of the 5 top pass catchers in the team. And so I don't really see where that offensive production is going to come from. And again,
I think losing Reynolds is a really killer blow to that offense, and he's kind of an unsung guy. He's a fourth round pick, which is probably higher than a lot of people thought he would go. But I loved him all year because he was that extra heart player. He would go out and make plays that kind of like maybe like an Ardarius Stewart for Alabama. He's a physical player, would go out there and get it when other guys wouldn't. And then I think the one they're really going to miss is Justin Evans, a really good safety in that secondary that had a lot of experience and made a lot of plays. Laid a serious lick on Derrick Henry in that game 2 years ago. So the more I look at really what they lost in terms of personnel, I'm starting to rethink my picks, but I'm not going to do it. It's too late.
yeah, no,
That's
yeah, I'm with you. I mean, Seals Jones and Noyle were both 5-star recruits, right? And a lot like I think we may go back and look at this team in a few years, given the talent level that was on paper. I don't know how these guys are going to turn out in the NFL, but I think it's entirely possible that receiving core may have been substantially better than we realized last year. And they just haven't had the quarterbacks to emphasize it. But again, I think when you lose those guys, it's only going to really hurt them. And why do I have them fifth though? And that's because when you look at Arkansas and Mississippi State, they lose just as much or more. Arkansas in particular, I think last year I'm surprised if we're going to have any Arkansas fans that tune in because I was harsh on them from day one. They had the big overtime win over TCU. My thing with that game was I didn't think either one of those teams was very good. I thought TCU was probably really overrated going into that game. Ended up being pretty darn justified when TCU wasn't very good the rest of the year. But again, similar problem here. 4 of 5 start top receivers for Arkansas squad were seniors. And the next best guy on the core, that was Raleigh Williams III. So, Arkansas returns one player with 200 or more yards receiving. In fact, they returned one player with 140 yards or more receiving. Only two guys on the roster, rather, with more than 10 receptions. And that's not good. It's one of, in receiving yards, okay, put this a different way, one of the top 7 in receiving yards. And we talked a lot about last year that Arkansas could not run the ball. They were a pass first team, and they had a very good quarterback in Austin Allen who was very underrated, but they don't recruit particularly well, and they haven't for a long time. And, it's hard to say, I know we hear things from camp and you can kind of keep your ear to the ground, but frankly, it's just so much BS because you're playing yourself and you don't know. And this is why we don't like to do a ton of stuff preseason, even though we're doing it anyway, because there's not really much to draw from. But I do kind of look back at recruiting. Arkansas's recruiting hasn't been very good, so I don't really have a lot of faith in Deion Stewart or Kendrick Jackson as starters. I think Jared Cornelius is a pretty good football player and one of their more explosive receivers, but it's like we said, when you lose these guys, you don't replace 1 with 2, you replace 1 with 4. Well, in their case, you're not replacing 1 with 4. You've gone from your 1, 2, and 3 receiver to your 3 receiver, your 8 receiver, and your 9 receiver. And that drop off could be pretty precipitous for a team that, let me reemphasize, could not run the ball. And that was with Raleigh Williams. And then defensively, I almost think it's a good thing that they have a lot of turnover defensively because they were so bad at times. But, with that said, it's not necessarily a great thing, right? Brooks Ellis was a pretty good headhunter. Ledbetter was good. Wise was really disruptive. But those guys were kind of the thumpers that kept them honest. And without them, they already struggled badly at keeping people on the perimeter, from getting the edge and sort of torching them. And they've gone to a 3-4 to try to get faster. But without the fact that they lost, Brooks Ellis was an absolute throwback, right? He was a thumper. He wasn't very fast and was almost efficient, frankly, covering sideline to sideline, but the guy could hit. And when you lose Wise and Ellis, I have real concerns about their ability to hold up in the middle as it was, much less with this change. I think they could get run over a little bit. So you put all this together, and I could see this being a really rough year for Austin Allen, where he tries to do everything by himself, and it just doesn't quite work.
Well, that one Arkansas fan that was hanging on is now
Well,
disconnected. No more.
we try to be honest in the show. I don't ever say anything because I dislike teams. I actually kind of like Arkansas, always kind of have, but I'm trying to call it like it is, and there's gonna be somebody in first place, and there's gonna be somebody in last place, and last year we were really tough on Arkansas, and I think a lot of people really took offense to it earlier in the year, particularly when they beat TCU, but it, as it turned out, I think we were pretty justified in doing so when they finished the season 7-5 and 3-5 in the SEC, right? And this year, frankly, I can't see that really improving. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see. TCU is going to be better, and I think Arkansas, frankly, is going to have to battle for a bowl this year, and I don't really see any way around it. So that's a tough road to haul for the Razorbacks, but it won't shock me if it's a 5-win team. And then finally, last in the conference is Mississippi State. Um, we've talked for a long time that the recruiting hasn't been great, and it was kind of always a deal that where drop off was likely. Last year, my preview for Missouri, the thing that I harped on for Missouri was just because you have a trend in something doesn't mean that it's going to happen. Or, as I put it there, quote, my first line from the Missouri preview was a repeated event does not guarantee a pattern. And what I was talking about was the Missouri defense, that they did not recruit very well, yet they'd had a lot of guys that kind of blowed up, into like first round NFL picks as pass rushers and whatnot. And, somehow managed to have this top 10 defense year after year. And, it's, I think, interesting that was my whole discussion was about the fact that you couldn't expect the defense to reload, that there was no, given the lack of talent, they probably shouldn't, even though everyone assumed they would. And the defense did implode last year. So I say all that because Mississippi State's got the same problem. They only returned 4 defensive starters. Um, Granted, their defense was bad last year, as it was, but just because it was bad doesn't necessarily mean it won't get a little bit worse. And there's some talent there with guys like Jeffrey Simmons coming in, but at the same, by the same coin, I don't know. I mean, I don't really see where they're bringing in a ton of talent, and they were flat deficient last year, both in run defense and in pass defense, but they were particularly bad against the pass. So I don't think they're gonna have a defense. I don't, and I'm sorry if that offends somebody that's a Mississippi State fan. Just the way I feel. Again, not all that different from Arkansas, and that's notable because whereas Arkansas had an explosive offense that could kind of make up for it, Mississippi State really did not. Nick Fitzgerald blew up late last year, but even when he blew up, and we've talked about this quite a bit, uh, he didn't blow up necessarily throwing the football. He ran over what was a pretty hapless team, frankly, in Ole Miss at the end of the season. And he, put up a ton of points against an Arkansas team that, like Mississippi State, had an atrocious defense. But for the most part of the end of the season with Texas A&M, who I don't know, had given up or what the heck had happened to them. But then Arkansas and Ole Miss, there wasn't a lot there. And again, that Ole Miss game, he was 8 of 17 passing, 47% passer in that Ole Miss game. He just ran the crap over them because they just couldn't stop a fly from running the ball at the end of the season. But we discussed that enough, I think, in the quarterback discussion. That where I stand with Fitzgerald. I think he's a very good athlete. I don't necessarily think he's a great passer, and I don't necessarily see that changing. So, given the fact that again, when you look at receivers, Mississippi State's in the same boat that everybody else is. They return Donald Gray, but they lose really the only real serious consistent threat they had in Fred Ross, somebody that showed up week in, week out. Fred Ross single-handedly accounted for a third of the receptions that Mississippi State had last year. And I know we're very young, particularly in depth at the receiving core, but they may have been young, but they were young with players that weren't, again, all that talented. So I just, I mean, frankly, they're just talent deficient. And I think you can kind of flip a coin between Arkansas and Mississippi State. I think if you want to put it in tiers, I have Alabama first tier, I think Auburn and LSU are in a second tier, and it's just kind of talent level. Ole Miss is almost in a talent level on its own. I think Ole Miss is roughly, maybe I think Auburn and LSU were probably both better than Florida or Georgia. Ole Miss is probably somewhat similar in terms of, but really volatile because of the coaching situation. But Texas A&M, Arkansas, and Mississippi State are all seriously deficient in a number of different areas, in my view. And I yeah, I think they could win, or yeah, I think they could frankly lose to just about anybody that's good, and I don't know that they're going to give a lot of problems. And the whole, I was the Grim Reaper last year, but on the whole, I'm not sure that things have got better for the SEC this year. I do think Auburn is the one team that's going to probably improve, and for the rest of the conference, it could be tough.
Yeah, I think in terms of calling it like we see it, I've always been a pretty staunch defender of the SEC because the numbers proved it out. I mean, how they competed out of conference showed that they were superior conference, not just in the bowls but also in the regular season. This year, from what I'm seeing in terms of personnel deficiencies and key personnel losses from the year before, I'm a little worried. I think the quarterback play across the board is going to be a good bit better in the SEC, but I think everywhere else, besides Alabama and, like you said, Auburn, maybe LSU if they can find something on offense, everywhere else you're going to see a lot of glaring weaknesses and things that teams are going to see exploited when they play these out-of-conference games, which hasn't historically been the case for the SEC this year. But yeah, I'm like you. I'm a little sell on SEC. I'm not buying right now, at least not in August. So that's it for us on the West Division rundown. We can save these for later and see how we do at the end of the year. I anticipate one of us having all of our picks right and the other looking really bad. It's probably going to be me. That looks bad. But anyway, so coming up later this week, we're going to have a couple of game previews for you. But also don't forget, we've posted some sort of preseason content from the draft and from the rundown of quarterbacks, new faces, and some returning quarterbacks as well. So thanks for tuning in, y'all. This has been a pretty good one. Again, as always, ran a little long. If we do it every week, does it mean we're running long? I don't know. But anyway, thanks so much. We'll see you next week. Give us a like if you liked it, and how about a subscribe if you loved it. Thanks so much.